everyone. I welcome you all to the CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today in discussion is a very important concept, is a very important idea, that is literature and ideology. So we have discussed about literature, we have reflected on the term literature, and we've also discussed a very seminal debate associated with this discipline. But now we are going to take forward the discussion and talk about the very important concept, that is of ideology. Now, as literature enthusiasts or as students of this discipline, this is a term that we cannot at all escape, even for those who may not be engaging with this discipline but are very avid readers who maybe read the newspapers every day. So you would come across this term, right? So this term we are going to look at ideology, particularly in conjunction with the discipline of literature, how the two seem to inform each other. So first, unpacking the term. Ideology, we understand, has different dimensions. Okay, so the first thing that we say is that one way of approaching the term ideology is that where we look at it as a unified set of ideas, right? So certain ideas which are kind of put together, and they form this kind of a unit. So the operative term over here also is the word unified. Now, what unifies a certain idea is some kind of a commonality, right? So some commonality which brings together a particular set of ideas then can be understood as ideology, right? That is one very fundamental way of approaching this term. Secondly, we can also look at this term as defining the beliefs, values, ways of thinking and feeling through which human beings perceive and explain what they understand as reality, right? So then ideology no longer is just a set of ideas. We further nuance this definition and we say that how ideology then also comes to define those beliefs, those values, the way of thinking, which then comes to kind of characterize human beings' perception of the world around them. So what are these values? What are these beliefs? Right? What are the ways in which they approach the world around them? So all of these taken together then also help us understand what ideology is, right? Or maybe we can also say that this is another way that ideology can be approached. A third approach to this concept is from the point of view of historical materialism. So according to this perspective, ideology is the product of the position and interests of a particular class. So now we come to the third so to say interpretation of the term, whereby we say that ideology is the product of the position and interests of a particular class. So initially we had said that how ideology is a unified set of ideas. Then we further nuanced the argument and we said that ideology also then is a particular way of approaching or seeing the world, which is then depicted in one's beliefs and values. And then thirdly, we come to this assertion that how ideology then also is a product of position and interests of a particular class. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean that in a society, we of course are aware that there are different classes, right? Classes which are a result of a particular kind of a economic structure at a given time in history, right? So the kind of economic structure that exists in society, that gives rise to certain classes, right? So then ideology then actually is seen as a product of the interest of a particular class, right? So which means what? That ideology then will refer to or will comprise those ideas which seem to reflect the interest of a particular class. Now, when we say a particular class, of course, we mean a class which is in dominance at a particular point of time, a class which is powerful at a particular point of time, right? So that's going to be the historical materialist understanding of the term. We might question then, is ideology a reflection only of the interest of the dominant class? The class which might be still emerging, the class which might still be, consolidating, does that not have ideology? It also does have ideology. It also does have its own set of ideas. But just that, those ideas may not have received that kind of legitimacy, that kind of, so to say, if we can use the term popularity, or that kind of acceptance as the ideology or the ideas of the dominant class would have got, right? So we also then to further understand that how what is the link between ideas and these different classes. We say that how each class then is defined by its own interests and worldview. Okay, so for instance, the working class will have its own interests, will have its own way of approaching reality. Okay, so where will their interests lie? Their interests will lie in the way they are treated by the capitalist or by the owner of the means of production, the kind of conditions that exist at their workplace, what they envision, what kind of future do they envision for themselves. So that's going to be a set of interests of maybe say the working class, right? Likewise, if we take a slightly different class, then that class is going to be is going to have its own worldview, its own perspective, and its own interests, right? So a consolidation then of the concerns of a particular class seems to be manifest in this concept of ideology, right? So to put it simply, ideology then becomes a way of seeing, defining, and explaining the world. All right. So, having explored these three dimensions of this term ideology, now we move on to discussing ideology as a critical concept. Right. Now, when I say a critical concept, what do I mean by that? That how ideology then helps us examine certain aspects of our life, as it also helps us examine certain works of art as well. So then ideology becomes a kind of a critical tool for us to better understand our reality and also certain representations of culture. So when we look at ideology as a critical concept, the first point that we make is that it permeates the social, cultural institutions of a particular period in history. What are these institutions? Morality, philosophy, legal system, literature, and other arts, right? So the first understanding then tells us that how ideology then is actually all pervasive. Ideology or a particular worldview can be seen in these social and cultural institutions at a particular point in history. So philosophy, morality, legal system, while they may be doing their own set of work, right, yet at the same time it is possible to locate a particular set of ideas that seem to have maybe a slightly more thrust, that seem to have a more power, or that seem to be a kind of a driving principle of the way these structures function at a particular point of time. So that's how we say that ideology also permeates these social cultural institutions, right? Now, the second thing that we say about ideology as a critical concept is that at times, ideology then also plays the function of legitimizing and perpetuating the interests of a particular group in society. Now, we just now said that how certain set of ideas seem to define a thrust in a cultural institution. So then, when we say that a particular side of or a particular kind of ideas, they they are dominant at a particular time, then in turn that brings us to a second important thing, that is how then these ideas or ideology then legitimizes or perpetuates the interests of a particular group in society. So those ideas, whoever those ideas are associated with the interests and worldview of a particular group, as we were discussing just now, right? So as the ideology finds expression through these various social cultural institutions, the work that it does is that it creates some kind of a consensus. It legitimizes and it perpetuates those ideas by means of being present in these different institutions. So what we do is that we start to internalize these ideas, and we start to accept them for what they are instead of questioning them. So that's how then ideology then works as a very potent tool in order to solidify the interest of a particular class in society at a given point of time, right? So next, these are the two things which then seem to kind of define ideology as a critical concept. So it helps us understand how different institutions around us, while they play their part, while they do the work that they do, for example, the legal framework, for example, the religious institution, while each is associated with a particular aspect of experience, yet at the same time, there is a certain set of ideas which is a driving force behind these institutions, certain set of ideas which then start to define the decisions made in these institutions, that come to define the structure of these institutions, right? So what are these ideas? These ideas then can be understood with the concept of ideology, and we say that how at a particular point in history these ideas then also seem to be serving the interest of a particular class. So when we look at ideology from this perspective, it helps us understand the dynamics of society and who is it whose interests are predominant, who is it whose interests are not being paid attention to. So this then kind of brings to us a very dynamic perspective of society in action. All right. Now from there we move to the last segment of our discussion, and which is also going to be kind of a culmination of this discussion, that is the literature and ideology. So far we have looked at these two terms in isolation, where we have reflected on these terms, we've reflected on them as conceptual categories, we've also understood them as critical categories. But now when we look at the two together, what are the insights that we get? How does ideology help us approach literature, or how do the two interact? That's something that we're going to discuss next. So the first thing that we say is that literature becomes the space where ideas operate and unfold, right? So now how does that happen? If you remember, we had discussed in the in one of the lectures, which is the first part, that is where we look at where we looked at the debate between aesthetic versus political, where we looked at literature as aesthetic category or literature as a space of ideas, right? So when we approach literature as a space of ideas, that is what ties it together to the idea of to the concept of ideology. So when I say that literature is a space of ideas, what do I mean by that? Or how do we spot these ideas? How do we know, or how do we examine these different thoughts, these different perspectives, operate in a piece of fiction? The first thing is that we notice it through the emphasis in the representation of experience, right? Whenever a particular experience or a moment or a context is represented in a given work of literature, where does the emphasis lie, right? What is it that is what aspect of experience is being emphasized upon? Is an emphasis on exploitation? Is there an emphasis on enjoying the luxuries of life? Is there an emphasis on some kind of a struggle? So the way the creator of a work of literature emphasizes, or what aspect that the creator, the author, the poet, the playwright, whatever aspect of experience that they choose to emphasize upon, is our first entry point into understanding what is the ideology or what are the ideas that the author is kind of defined by. The next thing is the choice of characters. So again, what are the kind of characters that we see the most in a work of fiction? Do we see kings, queens? Do we see the privileged, or do we see the common people? Or do we see, a particular section of society that is kind of undergoing a difficult time? So what are the characters that are picked up for representation, right? What are the voices that we see in the given work of literature? So that also, this observation as well is another entry point into understanding the kind of ideas which are driving a particular work of fiction. The next is, what are the kind of emotions which are evoked, and the way a set of ideas or a way a particular perspective unfolds in a given text, right? So all these elements then come together to help us understand what actually could be the possible ideas defining the representation or creation of a particular work. Moving on, this then brings to mind this seminal Hungarian thinker, that is George Lukács, right? So he talks about the idea of realism in fiction, and he sees realism as, and I quote, a reflection of life in the greatest concreteness and reality, and with all its motivating contradictions, unquote. So what is happening? Lukács is actually helping us understand, he's actually helping us kind of examine the representation of reality in fiction, and the way this reality is represented then kind of gives us some kind of a perspective on what are the kind of ideas which define the author's own sympathies. So he says that realism in fiction is a reflection of life in the greatest concreteness and clarity. So life is, so to say, concretized in fiction. Concretized how? Because a lot of things that we might experience in our everyday life, but we may not pay actual attention to them. But when they are reflected by means of particular situations, by means of particular interactions between characters, so that way then certain issues which pertain to life and reality are concretized, or they get this kind of a solid substance in literature. And this reality then also, as represented in a work of realist fiction, also points towards the motivating contradictions, as Lukács says. So contradictions means what? We all understand that how at a particular point of time in history there are different impulses which coexist. There are opposing ideas which seem to coexist, and literature then gives space, or particularly a work of or maybe the creator of realist fiction then would give voice to these opposite set of ideas, these opposite set of realities that may be manifest in material life, right? So when these contradictions then are they find space in literature, that also makes us aware of this clash of thought, this clash of perspective, this clash of different ideologies, right? Our next understanding of literature and ideology brings to mind this another very seminal thinker, that is Pierre Macheret. Now, he actually shares a slightly different understanding of literature vis-a-vis ideology. Now, he says literature distances itself from its ideology by its fiction and form, right? So, while other understanding of would actually tell us that how literature then engages, or literature then becomes a source of a particular set of ideas, or literature then seems to legitimize a certain kind of ideology. But Macheret says that works of literature instead distance themselves from the ideology by the fiction and form. So for him, the fictional element or the form in which a particular experience is encoded, so by means of its imaginative aspect, by means of its fictional aspect, that is how a work of literature then distances itself from ideology. So ideology in the sense of ideas which are traceable in lived reality, somewhat for Macheret there's a little gap between a work of literature and that ideology, right? But then he seems to somewhat qualify his statements when he says that but the silences or the gaps in the text and what the text fails to say is because of its inherent ideology that makes it impossible to say. Right? So it's a very interesting perspective by Macheret. So while on the one hand Macheret says that by means of fiction and form, literature consciously distances itself from ideology, but then at the same time he seems to be saying that when we examine the silences, when we examine the gaps, when we examine that how certain aspects of experience do not find expression in a particular work, this kind of a study then tells us that how a text fails to say a few things because of its inherent ideology, makes it impossible to say those things. So ideology then, according to Macheret, is that unconscious presence in literature instead of a very active engagement of fiction with ideas, right? So that's a slightly different understanding that we get through Macheret. Right. So what we have seen then is that how the concept of literature and ideology are intertwined. They help us understand literature as a cultural category. It helps us understand what role that these imaginative works of writing or these imaginative writings do, and how they are not only a source of entertainment, of pleasure, they are not only aesthetic categories, but at the same time they also seem to reflect, legitimize, perpetuate certain ideas, and at the same time they also the silences in the works of literature then also helps us understand the ideology which may not be very clearly expressed in fiction, right? So ideology as a defining feature of a piece of writing, and also at the same time which can sometimes be overt, that is identifiable, and sometimes it works on the sly. But all in all, we see that how ideology then helps us kind of examine literature as a space which is enabling, which makes us think about certain ideas, which makes us think about certain aspects of experience, and that too from a particular point of view. That's how these two concepts then become enabling for us students of literature. Thank you.